Okay, so we're now going to get started. Again, thank you so much to those of you who have already introduced yourselves. If you haven't had the chance yet, please feel free to use the chat box. You are joining us today for Inclusionary Housing, Harnessing Market Forces. My name is Lauren Sigmund, and I am a training senior specialist at Grounded Solutions Network, and I will be facilitating today's presentation along with my colleague Naaman Freeman and our featured guest Abdi Hamoud from Fairfax County, Virginia. So we're really glad to have you here. And again, if you haven't had a chance yet to introduce yourself, please feel free to join us in the chat. So this training is presented by Grounded Solutions Network. We are a national membership organization that seeks to cultivate communities that are equitable, inclusive, and rich in opportunity. And we do this by advancing affordable housing solutions that last for generation after generation. And we're glad that you're able to join for this call. It's one of our many offerings. In addition to trainings and membership benefits, we also provide technical assistance and everything we can to bring lasting solutions for affordable housing to folks across the United States. So today's training will focus on inclusionary housing policies, how they can leverage market forces, how they can be structured, and what they can do, as well as trends and best practices learned from programs on the ground. And before we get started, though, I just want to set us up for to make sure everyone's tech is working smoothly. So to set up your audio, if you're having any trouble, feel free to select the microphone or connect audio button at the very bottom on the left side of your navigation bar. And we recommend selecting the tab that says Computer Audio, or if you need it, you also can select Call Me to have the webinar platform call your phone directly. And if you have any questions about setting up your audio, or you're having any trouble, or if you have questions, comments, ideas that you want to share with us during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat box, which is on the right side of your navigation bar. I'm going to be monitoring the chat throughout the session, as will our presenters, so feel free to put your thoughts and questions in there throughout. A quick note that you all are muted automatically, but when we get to the question and answer period, we absolutely encourage you to unmute yourself, ask questions, share comments, and really be as involved as you'd like to be. We really think that'll help drive forward the conversation. So this class is being presented today as a part of our online training institute from Grounded Solutions Network. And I want to just mention that our trainings typically have a participant fee, but we're really glad that we're able to offer this one free of charge with no fee, thanks to the generous support of our sponsors, including City Community Development Fund. And today's program, as I mentioned, is one of many of our trainings that are being offered throughout the year as an element of our online training institute. And so we hope that you'll join us for future courses. Each of the courses within our institute is really tailored to staff at community land trusts, for nonprofit housing practitioners, for state and local policymakers and practitioners, and really anyone working in the realm of affordable housing and shared equity home ownership. So if you're interested in any of the trainings that you see on your screen, you can visit groundedsolutions.org/events to stay tuned for more information and to be the first to register for these online courses, or to even apply for some scholarship funds that we still have available to cover the costs associated with some of our courses. And of course, if you have questions, you can also always contact us at helpdesk@groundedsolutions.org with any questions you have about our online training programs. So to kick us off, today's conversation is going to be interactive in nature, as I mentioned. So we encourage you to turn on your webcam if you have one, take yourself off of mute to ask questions, share your thoughts in the chat box, and really participate actively throughout the presentation. The more that you engage in this experience, the more that you'll get out of it is our hope and the bet we're taking today. So today we're going to start by reviewing the ins and outs of inclusionary housing. We'll then test your knowledge with a fun interactive game of fact or fiction. We'll hear next from our featured guest, Abdi Hamoud from Fairfax County's Department of Housing and Community Development, as he tells the story of inclusionary housing in his county. We'll have some time for Q&A, and we'll wrap up our time today by sharing some next steps and beneficial resources for your use. And so now I'm pleased to pass things over to my colleague, Senior Specialist of State and Local Policy, Naaman Freeman. Naaman, take it away.
Thank you, Lauren. Let me go ahead and take that away from you. 2 seconds. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to do a quick but relatively deep dive into inclusionary housing. As you probably already know, Ground Up Solutions Network is committed to supporting affordable housing with truly lasting affordability. Inclusionary housing programs and policies, when done right, are a great way to ensure resources have a lasting impact. So here's what I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes. So hang on to your hat as we breeze through this overview. All right. So what are inclusionary housing policies, and why might you want to adopt one in your jurisdiction? Right. At their essence, inclusionary housing policies tie the creation of affordable homes to the construction of market rate housing or commercial development. In its simplest form, an inclusionary housing program might require developers to sell or rent 10 to 20% of new residential units to lower income residents. There are other alternative forms of inclusionary policies like linkage fees and residential impact fees, but the rest of this presentation will focus mainly on traditional inclusionary housing programs. There are over 1,500 inclusionary housing programs in over 900 jurisdictions across the country. This includes all three types of approaches I just described: traditional inclusionary housing, residential impact fees, and commercial linkage fees. So here's the problem that inclusionary housing is trying to solve. This will probably sound pretty familiar to most of you. So communities want to see new investment and growth, everything from new job opportunities to public investment in transit, roads, schools, and parks. But when the benefits finally arrive, making neighborhoods more attractive, suddenly people want to move in. It's only natural, right? And that increases the demand for housing. Housing supply struggles keep up with demand, so prices go up. In many hot markets, development is taking place in historically lower income neighborhoods and communities of color. These local residents bear much of the burden in the form of higher rents and displacement pressure. New housing is being priced at the top of the market rather than various price points because there continues to be a demand at the level in construction, and costs aren't cheap. So communities struggle with how to meet dual priorities: bringing new investment into their towns, cities, and housing stock, and protecting what makes their city unique by holding on to the people who make their city unique. By requiring that developers include affordable units within their projects, inclusionary housing makes it more likely that some community members will be able to stay within their neighborhood even as it changes. It also does not require any upfront public subsidy, an important thing to remember in a world where federal housing assistance and local subsidies continue to dwindle. So now let's move on to the core program elements. Here are some of the core elements of any inclusionary housing policy. There are a myriad of other details that policies should also address, but with limited time, we'll stick to these main components today. So what percentage of new market rate development should be set aside at lower prices for low income residents? You know, the inclusionary percentage can vary between ownership and rental projects. You know, most commonly you see between 10% and 20%. The most important consideration for setting your inclusionary percentage is what is financially feasible for developers in our market, right? Income levels. A key question is, what household income levels do we want to serve with our community? Income levels are typically defined as a percentage of area median income, AMI, or median family income. Income targets are often higher for ownership units than for rental units. In many communities, the rental market offers units that are affordable to households making 80% of AMI. On the other hand, people making 80% of AMI often struggle to find affordable home ownership opportunities in the market. So income levels for inclusionary housing ownership programs are often 80% or higher. So you think that a jurisdiction would automatically opt to serve lower income households, but there is a trade-off. think somebody unmuted there. Because it costs more to provide homes for families with lower incomes, if you want deeper affordability, it will only be feasible to require a lower overall percentage of affordable units. Many inclusionary housing programs now include multiple tiers of affordability, either allowing developers to choose between a smaller percentage of units for lower income levels or a larger percentage of units for more moderate income levels, or requiring or allowing a mix, with developers providing some units for lower levels and some for moderate incomes. So mandatory or voluntary? Mandatory equals when developers must comply. And voluntary is when developers can choose to provide affordable housing units in exchange for access to financial benefits or incentives like zoning variances. So is it legal? Like some states like Texas, Tennessee, Wisconsin have legislation outright banning some form of mandatory inclusionary housing, or legislation banning rent control that has been interpreted to mean that inclusionary housing policies on rental units are also not legal. So experience has shown that mandatory programs produce significantly more units than voluntary programs, often because developers simply don't have to choose to take advantage of the benefits offered in voluntary programs. Roughly 3/4 of jurisdictions have an IH program that roughly 3/4 of jurisdictions that have inclusionary housing programs have at least some mandatory element to them. Remember, I said we'd speak a little bit about how inclusionary programs incorporate lasting affordability. Well, this is it. So sustaining affordable homes after they're built is much more economical than having to invest in building new ones, because old ones have reverted to market prices or otherwise fell off the radar. Think about the affordability term like this. For every year that a unit remains affordable, that's one less unit that the city will have to replace through new construction. The longer the term of affordability, the more valuable the affordable unit is to the city. Plus, it's a critical one for places that may wind up building a relatively small number of affordable units each year, as these will only add up to having an impact if they stay affordable over time. It's best to set your affordability term as long as possible, ideally in perpetuity for the life of the building, or 99 years. Some states have laws limiting the allowable term of affordability. You'll want to check what's legal in your state. For homeownership units, a best practice is to reset the clock. Start the affordability term again at 0 whenever a home is sold. In many cases, this can achieve permanent affordability even if the term of affordability is only, say, 30 years. Roughly 90% of inclusionary housing programs have a term of affordability of 30 years or more. About a third of programs require affordability in perpetuity or for the life of the building. In terms of where the policy applies, there are two main options. Apply the policy consistently across the whole jurisdiction, or vary applicability in different areas of the jurisdiction based on the housing market strength or other considerations as seen in the illustration here from my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. 70% of programs nationwide apply to the entire jurisdiction, which is much simpler policy to administer. Many communities offer developers alternative ways to comply with inclusionary requirements other than building the units on site. The most commonly used compliance alternative is to allow developers to pay a fee in lieu of building units. An in lieu fees are generally paid into a housing trust fund and used often along with other funding sources to finance affordable housing developed off-site. So over 2/3 of programs nationwide offer compliance alternatives. One key point that I want to make before we shift into our next section though, is that passing an inclusionary housing policy is only the first step. Equally important are ensuring implementation and administration of the policy, and then stewardship of the affordable units is generated. This includes both short-term implementation, for example, ensuring that plans aren't approved and certificates of occupancy aren't issued unless developers have complied with the policy, and long-term stewardship, managing resales and finding new owners for existing units, as well as monitoring for compliance over a longer period of time. While we have limited time today and won't dig deeply into the economics of inclusionary housing, we'd like to make you aware of a future webinar we're hosting on May 8th. This course will be aimed primarily at discussing the overall real estate economics that are considered when developing inclusionary policy and the effects of inclusionary policies on those development economics. We'll be joined by practitioners from the district, DC, and their Office of Planning, and a local developer who's actually worked and complied with a number of the inclusionary policies in the region. So, developer incentives. We're going to talk briefly about how a policy or program incentivizes a developer to comply. And honestly, we could spend an entire webinar simply on incentives and their importance to the real estate economics, but that's why we're offering that separate webinar on May 8th. So, developer incentives, Many IH programs provide some financial incentives for developers to fully or partially offset the cost of inclusionary requirements. Here are some of the options that you have for incentives. Of these, the density bonus, which provides an increase in allowed dwelling units per acre. Floor area ratio, or FAR, or height, is one of the most common, followed by zoning variances like reductions in parking requirements. And you also have direct financial incentives, like tax abatements or the use of TIFs, or tax increment financing. These are a bit less common. In the last couple of minutes, let's talk about what it takes to create a really successful inclusionary policy. So take a look at all these key traits of successful policies. We've covered most of these throughout the presentation, but I want to touch on a couple of new ones. You want to make sure that your policy sets consistent expectations. It's really important to have a standard, predictable, and consistently applied policy because it reduces risk, and risk is associated with cost, and it enables the market to adjust to the new requirements. You want to make sure it targets areas of growth. If you're in the middle of a planning effort to upzone the neighborhood, don't give away density. Be sure to add in affordability requirements that at the moment of upzoning to take advantage of the increase in land value that comes with upzoning. Simple and easy to understand may seem to conflict with some of these other recommendations, targeting areas of growth, offering alternative options, etc. But this is indeed the challenge of coming up or developing a proper inclusionary housing program. The balance between calibration and simplicity is key. So I think we've now come to time to kind of play a quick game of fact versus fiction. I'm going to present a statement, and you all in the audience are going to reply in the chat with fact or fiction, and let's see who's actually been paying attention through the first half of this session. So, most inclusionary housing programs require developers to provide inclusionary housing units on site. Few allow alternative mechanisms for compliance. Fact or fiction? Let's see what you guys think. All right. So it looks like most of you got that one right. All right. It's fiction. Flexibility is key to an inclusionary housing program if not mandated. Allowing alternative means for compliance ensures you aren't imposing unrealistic expectations across a jurisdiction with varying markets. Right? Every area of your jurisdiction is not going to have the same housing market, and you want to make sure you provide some levers to allow developers to be flexible and comply. All right, let's do a couple more. Inclusionary housing programs usually require a trade-off between the percentage of units that are affordable and the depth of affordability. Oh, wow. Even better this time, guys. This is a fact. This is a fact, right? So usually, I mean, there is a trade-off, right? If you're going to ask on a specific site where they're complying with inclusionary program, that the developer reach deeper as far as the level of affordability, meaning that the AMI levels are, say, around 40% of AMI. Each one of those units is going to cost more than the units that it would the units for that would be affordable to someone making 80% AMI, which means you can't provide as many units. So this is a really big trade-off that you have to think about. All right, we're gonna do one more. Uh-oh, hopefully you guys can see that. Let's see. All right. Most inclusionary housing programs have an affordability terms of less than 30 years. All right, most of you got that one right, but it's fiction. 90% of programs have affordability terms of 30 years or more, and 1/3 of programs require permanent affordability. All right, that was pretty good. You guys did really well. I'd say I'd have to pass everyone in here. So now I'm going to introduce our famed guest speaker. It's Abdi Hamoud of Fairfax County, Virginia. And he's going to talk to you a bit about their inclusionary housing programs, because they have multiple, and how the process for implementing those and how they came about and how successful they've been. Abdi, you want to take it over?
Abdi, it looks like you were on mute, but you should be able to, good to go now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and we're really excited to be a part of this webinar. As Naiman stated, I'm Abdi Hamoud. My role here is I'm the Affordable and Workforce Housing Program Administrator for Fairfax County, Virginia. I work directly for Fairfax County Department of Housing and Community Development, and we are also staff for our Fairfax County Redevelopment and Housing Authority. Before we jump into the presentation and talk about our inclusionary zoning programs, I just want to provide some context of where Fairfax County, Virginia is. My first slide presents a map, and we are a suburb of Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. is to the east of us. And if you are familiar with the area, Dulles International Airport is to the left of us. So we're a fairly large jurisdiction in Northern Virginia. Although we are a suburb of Washington, D.C., I do want to highlight that we are in the state of Virginia. And the reason I mentioned this, we are a Dillon Rule state. So for local government, in order for us to pass our inclusionary housing or zoning programs, we have to get authority from the state. So without the state of Virginia giving us this authority, we would not be able to implement and administer the program. And a little bit more about Fairfax County as far as our government structure. We are an urban county executive structure, which means we have a board of supervisors with one chairman and a county executive that administers the day-to-day of Fairfax County. So just to give you a little bit of context if you're not familiar with Fairfax County, Virginia. A little bit more about our county. We have approximately 400 square miles. As far as residents, we have 1.2 million people. In the 2018 area median income for the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area is $117,200 for a household size of 4. Just to give you an idea of as far as some of the challenges of affordable housing, We provided some data for our cost burden residents. And what cost burden means is defined by HUD as a household that spends more than 30% of their income either to pay for rent or to pay for their mortgage. So we have 44% of our renters that are cost burden, which amounts to almost 55,000 people, and 23% of our homeowners that are cost burden, which amounts to about 60,000 people. So just trying to provide a context as far as some of the affordable housing challenges that we have. Our Fairfax County Board of Supervisors outlined a few goals that is in their comprehensive plan with regard to affordable and workforce housing. They want to provide affordable housing opportunities to all who live and work in Fairfax County. And they also want the affordable housing to be decent, safe, and located near employment centers and also public transportation. There are two main tools or programs that we use through our inclusionary housing program. The first is the Affordable Dwelling Unit Program, and the next is the Workforce Dwelling Unit Program. The Affordable Dwelling Unit Program is administered through our zoning ordinance, and our Workforce Dwelling Unit Program is administered through the comprehensive plan. And I'll go into detail about those two programs. But prior to jumping into that, I do want to mention we administer, I am a staff member for our Department of Housing and Community Development. However, we do administer the program with our partners at the Department of Planning and Zoning. And we work together to both administer and implement the program together. So I do want to highlight that and emphasize that. Our planning and zoning partners and staff work directly with developers, are the first line of contact with developers when development applications or proposals are presented. And our Department of Housing Community Development staff, once units are constructed, work with the developer to bring the units into the program and ensure that the units are affordable and stay in our program all the way through the end of the affordability period. So I did want to highlight the partnership with our planning and zoning staff. A little bit about our Affordable Dwelling Unit Program. It was adopted by the Board of Supervisors in 1990. As I mentioned, it is mandatory under the zoning ordinance. And there is both a rental and a for sale component to the program. The threshold that triggers the requirements under the Affordable Dwelling Unit Program is 50 units or more. So if there is a project that has less than 50 units, there's an expectation to make a contribution to a housing trust fund. So a good example of that is we will, some projects that have just consist entirely of single family homes would have units, maybe 30, 40 units within that project. They're not required to provide affordable dwelling units, however, a contribution to our housing trust fund. And the maximum density bonus that a developer could receive is up to 20%. So once again, connecting to the incentives that was covered in the presentation before, that is the incentive for the developers. Once again, I do want to mention that our ADU ordinance did require state approval, and it was one of the first programs in the state of Virginia and has been around for almost 30 years. The last point I want to make is the construction type that typically triggers an affordable dwelling unit program. And it's typically what's referred to as type 5 construction, which is wood frame structure, and as far as townhouses, and then in multifamily projects, 4 stories or less. Next, I want to mention, as I mentioned, that there are 2 components to the Affordable Dwelling Unit Program, quickly focusing on the rental program. Developers are required to provide up to 6.25% of new multifamily developments as affordable dwelling units. This program serves 2 income tiers. So 1/3 of the units are affordable to households at 50% of the area median income, and the remaining 2/3 to households at 70% of the area median income. So for example, if a project was expected to deliver 24 affordable dwelling units, 8 of those would be at the 50% tier, and then the remaining 16 would be at the 70% tier. And then our control period, or what is known as the affordability period, it's 30 years for our rental program. After that 30 years, the units are affordable for the 30 years. In the rental program, after the 30 years, that affordability term expires, and the owner could rent those units as market rate units. So I did want to highlight that. Our for sale program requires developers to set aside up to 12.5% of single family attached or detached, which are townhouses or single family homes. This program caps at 70% of the area median income, so that purchasers would have to make up to 70% of the area median income. And once again, this program has a 30-year control period, but it is renewable for each new owner. So as mentioned in the previous slides and presentation, that there's basically a reset of the clock. And that's to preserve units and to ensure that the units are affordable and preserved. Just a couple quick things that I want to touch on as far as that initial control period. You know, owners would have to owner occupy the unit. They cannot rent out the unit. And they would have to work with staff if they're interested in reselling the unit or refinancing. And there's an annual occupancy certification that goes out to all owners to ensure that they remain in the property. After the control period, if somebody does remain in there for 30 years, all of the restrictions expire, but there are 2 provisions that still remain. The housing authority has the first right of repurchase, and there's what is called the equity share provision at the end of the affordability term. So I did want to highlight those parts of the program. As I mentioned, you know, the affordable dwelling unit program has been around for 30 years. However, there are a lot of construction types that are exempt from that. So the board decided to create what is called the workforce dwelling unit policy. So in contrast to the affordable dwelling unit program, this is not mandatory under our zoning ordinance, but it's proffer-based and is voluntary. And basically, a proffer is a voluntary proposal for rezoning to mitigate certain impacts of residential development, the impacts of schools, impacts to roads, parks, etc. So it is in essence voluntary, but it is administered through our land use and rezoning process. It's designed to encourage voluntary development to create new workforce housing. And this development focuses on high density, mixed-use centers. And I'll provide a couple of examples in a couple slides later. And overall, the incentive is that the developers could achieve up to, I think, 20% density bonus. This is administered through our comprehensive plan, and it impacts units that are typically exempt from affordable dwelling unit requirements. So mid-rise and high-rise construction would trigger a workforce dwelling unit requirement. So basically, the way I put it, it kind of picks up where the affordable dwelling unit program leaves off. Within our workforce dwelling unit policy, there are, that's an overarching policy, but there's 2 components. There's a countywide expectation, and then there's what is called the Tyson's policy, which I will get into a couple slides later, that is focused on a certain part of Fairfax County. The countywide WDU policy expects the developers to set aside a minimum of 12% of all residential units. It serves 3 income tiers equally, the 80, 100, and 120% of AMI. And just to take a step back, a little history, this policy was created and adopted by the board in 2007. And it is kind of a product of its time in the sense that real estate development and affordable housing was significantly different at that time. So I think the board envisioned a need for units at the 100 and 120% AMI, but that might not be the case. So I just want to kind of provide a little context. With regard to the affordability terms, for the rental program is 50 years, and for the for sale program is 30 years. So just to give you a simple example, if there's a development with 300 units, 12% of those units, which equals to 36 units, would be expected to be WDUs, and there would 12 units at each AMI. So just to give you an example. And since we started seeing the first construction of workforce dwelling units somewhere around 2014. So since 2014, there have been about a little over 750 rental units that have been created through this program and 22 for sale units. So the exciting news is we are seeing results from this policy. Quickly moving on to the Tyson's WDU policy, it's almost exact as the countywide. There's just difference in the expectation of the number of the percentage of units and the AMIs that are served. The developers are expected to set aside about 20% of the units as rental units as WDUs, and anywhere from 14 to 16% of units as for sale, and it serves a wider range of incomes from 60 to 120% of the AMI. Just taking a step back, Tyson's is an area where Fairfax County is the intent is to make it by 2050. It's downtown. Just a little some facts about Tyson's. There's recently been with the Washington D.C. area, our metro. There's recently been a silver line that extends from D.C. all the way to Reston, Virginia. And then that's phase 1, and the phase 2 would be from Reston all the way to Dulles. So that is kind of a big deal because with Metro and Tyson's and Reston's and all the way down the Silver Line, there are a lot of economic opportunity to jobs. So it's really, we're seeing a lot of development across the Silver Line where Tyson's and Reston, Virginia are. Giving you some I wanted to kind of shed a little bit more light on Tyson's, Virginia, and the history. In the 50s, it was a farming community. In the 70s, it became a major employment and retail center. And then in the 90s, it's been thriving as a corporate center. So there's really been a lot of growth and change in Tyson's. By 2050, Fairfax County envisions that there's going to be 100,000 residents and 200,000 jobs in Tyson. So they really are trying to make it the downtown of Fairfax County. And with that, there's going to be infrastructure that's going to be built to support the development and the metro line that has been recently added in 2014. Just to give you some context, like I said, ever since 2014, there's been about 7 multifamily projects. All have been high-rise construction, anywhere from 20 to 30 stories, and anywhere from 300 to 400 units total. From that, there's a 20% expectation of WDUs. So to date, there's been approximately about 500 rental units since 2014 that have been created across the 5 income tiers, from 60% of the AMI all the way to 120% of the AMI. Quickly, just want to talk about, as we mentioned, program development and implementation. The key thing, from all the programs that Fairfax County has started, the first step is really establishing a task force, that will look at developer recommendations. The important thing is to have the right people at the table representing developers, residents, and the nonprofit affordable housing sector. And we really utilize our zoning ordinance and comprehensive plan and our planning and zoning staff and our housing and community development staff to implement the programs. Just quickly, with regard to staffing and monitoring, staff is responsible to work with our attorneys on reviewing covenants that are recorded against the properties to ensure the affordability, and then the offer agreement is a legal document that spells out the number of units and AMI served. We set income limits, rents, and sale prices. We provide property and leasing staff training, and we review monthly reporting and work on enforcement. And we're also here to help out the property and leasing staff and tenants in the event that there are any challenges. And our staff on the home ownership side are responsible to facilitate sales all the way from marketing to settlement, in addition to providing home ownership education. Lastly, I mean, throughout, there's been policy modifications. We do periodically look at our programs, try to get feedback from all participants, and there have been amendments to our program regulations and our zoning ordinance, especially for the ADU program that's been around for 30 years. It's really just looking at it and trying to enhance it using best practices, but also understanding market condition and challenges. So it's really important that you take a look at your programs as you put them in place. We're currently looking at our workforce dwelling unit program to see if those 100 and 120% AMIs are really adding value. But that was really Fairfax County, our inclusionary zoning programs in a nutshell. And I'll kick it back to our Ground of Solution staff.
Great, thank you so much. We're now going to have some time for questions that folks might have for Naaman or for Abdi. And I just want to start kicking us off by, I'll read off some of the questions that we saw in the chat that came up. Folks are also welcome afterward to unmute themselves and feel free to ask a question out loud. Okay, so we have a question. Can you restate the required percentage of WDU? I thought you said 12% must be set aside. Is the ownership set aside smaller? The example of 751 units only says 22 ownership units are affordable, or is that 22 units in each of the 3 income tiers? Someone wants us to get really into the weeds.
Yeah, so I did throw a lot out there. The way I want to answer that, it's project by project. So with the programs, there are two, it could, with the workforce dwelling unit program, it could be anywhere from 12 to 20% of the units, but for each project. So I think that's an easy way to put it. It depends on where the units are being built, and that would require whether it's 12% or 20%. And it's so the example I gave, if there's a market rate project, 300 units, and it's outside of Tyson's, it's in another place in the county, it'll be a 12% expectation. So 36 of those units would be expected to be provided as WDUs. So hopefully that's answered the question.
Great, thank you. And another question we have in the chat: who certifies buyers and sale prices? If the county, how many staff are there?
On a rental side, we train our property and leasing staff. On the home ownership staff side, we have internal staff up to, I want to say, 12 staff members, and that's counting administrative all the way to senior management.
All right, another question. Abdi referenced that staff, e.g. property managers, are trained to address challenges that might arise. Could you say more about that? How do you adequately prepare staff to manage the often contentious dynamics between residents of different income tiers?
So I'm going to get to that question. My computer's going to reboot me, but I'm going to start back up on another one. So if you could segue to another question, and I'll be...
I'll try and, Abdi, while you take care of the technical issue, I'll try and answer that question. So if I understand it right, let me look at the question one more time. It's, it says Abdi referenced that staff are trained to address challenges that might arise. Could you say more about that? I've worked at the New York City Department of City Planning, and I was there when we were putting together the policies for mandatory inclusionary housing and the associated zoning for quality and affordability. I'd say there were a number of intensive trainings and kind of, you know, there were test runs that each of the borough offices, which is where our kind of borough planners reside in a borough office, that they have specific neighborhoods that they're kind of tied to. They had a specific presentation that was specific to the built environment in their neighborhood and talked about the incomes in their neighborhood, and were able to speak to the policy and what affordability levels they'd be serving and how that would affect their neighborhood on a very specific basis. And that training and that conversation went on for almost a year and a half prior to the policy actually even entering public review. And it was key to kind of gaining some of the kind of the support needed to get that proposition passed.
Great, thank you, Naaman. I just want to give a chance if anyone was hoping to come off mute. We have some questions in the chat box we can get to, but if anyone has a question they want to read out loud, or if they want to name a question that they put into the chat, please feel free to do so now.
I'd like to ask a question about AMI, because both presentations have made it clear that this is such a key fundamental factor in all these programs. Now, the case in Boston is that the AMI in the neighborhood of Roxbury, a Black community, is $37K. But I should say the median income, the actual median income is $37K.
Mm-hmm.
But the AMI, which is calculated including even part of New Hampshire and wealthy neighborhoods, is twice that.
Right.
So basically, if we're looking at something called AMI and it's actually not a valid metric, that just skews everything so badly. It's just, you know, you can see the implications. So I guess what I'm asking is, what are cases you've seen or places that have successfully challenged this just on the merits as an invalid metric?
Whew, that's a heavy question.
Well, it's key though. Sorry, because it's basically a fraud.
I totally understand what you're saying, and we've dealt with some of the same issues here in New York City, where, you know, the median family income in a specific census tract or neighborhood, there's a huge disparity between that and the AMI for the entire region of New York. And the same for Boston and most of our MSAs or metro regions. I think the issue is that, you know, income data is usually collected during the census, right? Or that data is held at the federal level, and these are metrics that are given to us by organizations, institutions that kind of pass that down. I have not personally seen or not aware of one. There very well could be, but I'm not personally aware of someone who's found a new metric to use. And it's really a data question. And, you know, a lot of what we do depends on proper data, just like you said.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in on the chat. I am pretty confident we won't have time to cover all of them, but do know that we're sharing our contact information at the end of this presentation, folks. So if you didn't get your answer today, feel free to follow up. Another question that we've had: how do you select the families or individuals to occupy newly constructed affordable units from among eligible applicants of whether it's a lottery or a waiting list or other? And Naaman, maybe you can speak on some of those options.
I can speak on that. So it's I can speak on both the Fairfax, Virginia case and in New York City. In New York City, you know, there's a huge housing lottery. We have interactive tools online where you can apply, and it's pretty easy to enter that pool for either for all of the housing that's available in the city or specific developments within a certain neighborhood. As far as Fairfax County, Virginia, that application process, there is a housing brochure that lists that's available to be, like, I think it's downloadable online, that you can get access to. They update rather frequently as new developments come up that show where the units are located, what the AMIs are serving, what the income would be for a family of 4 or a family of 3 or a family of 2 or 1. And then you have to go through Fairfax County's kind of process, which I'm not 100% clear on that as of yet, but you have to go through their process for applying. And I believe that application process is not yet online, but I may be wrong.
Okay, so at this point, I'm actually going to hit pause on our questions. I super appreciate all the great questions that have been coming in. If you feel your question hasn't been answered, we're also going to be able to save this chat after the call. So if you want someone to follow up with you, please feel free to stick your email address into the chat box. If you don't want it full group, you can just send it to me directly, and we'll make sure that you get answers to all of your questions. So for now, we just want to close out by sharing some additional resources that we think will be helpful for you. So let me get those slides to you. Aha, and I've accidentally snuck ahead to our contact information, but feel free to use that as well, and we'll share that with you at the end in addition. Okay, so we have a ton of resources that we hope will be helpful to you in designing or revising an inclusionary housing program. First item that I should mention is inclusionaryhousing.org, which has everything you might need to know to design a policy and implement a program, including a lot of more details on the content from this webinar. So definitely encourage you to check out that website. It's the home base for a lot of the other resources that I'm going to mention as well. Also, our interactive inclusionary housing database map tool is a nationwide database of inclusionary housing programs with information on those 900+ programs that Naaman mentioned earlier. And we also on the website have an inclusionary housing calculator. This is an interactive online real estate pro forma tool that illustrates the economic impacts of affordable housing requirements and developer incentives on different types of housing projects. So you can use this to play around with the conditions and some of the programs you're exploring for your specific local context. And finally, Grounded Solutions Network also offers policy consulting services. We offer technical assistance to jurisdictions who are looking to design or update an inclusionary housing policy or other affordable housing policies. And some of our past clients have included New Orleans, Pittsburgh, Seattle, Atlanta, New York, Minneapolis, Nashville, Denver, Detroit. It's a long list, so please don't hesitate to be in touch if we can be helpful in providing technical assistance. And if you're not already a member of Grounded Solutions Network, I would encourage you to consider joining us for even more benefits. There's a lot of reasons to join, including discounted access to our online trading institute, technical assistance grants, scholarships to conferences and in-person trainings, access to more extensive resources, one-on-one support, and a lot more. So if you're interested in membership, we encourage you to visit groundedsolutions.org/membership. And if you found today's training to be helpful, we hope you'll join us at future learning opportunities, especially on May 8th, Mythbusters, Economics of Inclusionary Housing. We think that might be a great fit for folks who found this call to be of interest and of use. And we also have a number of discounted registrations available for our paid courses. So we definitely encourage you to visit groundedsolutions.org/events, where you can register for any of our courses and learn more about our scholarship opportunities. And so last thing I'll mention, after this call, you're going to be receiving an email with the call recording, a copy of the slides, and a few other helpful resources. We encourage you to please take a few moments to also share your feedback with us on today's session. This will help us to continue to improve our offerings and really make sure we're catering to your areas of interest. So any feedback you can share would be a big help. And now finally, here's our contact information for Naaman and for Abdi if you have more questions that you want to follow up with. Again, if your question wasn't answered, you can also stick your email in the chat and we'll grab that at the end. So please don't hesitate to be in touch, and thank you so much for joining today's call. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You'll be missed, Lauren.
Thank you.